Good evening, everyone. Welcome. So great to see you all this evening. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to be able to introduce tonight's guest speakers to you on the topic of the impact of police violence on public health. I believe we are all in consensus here in holding that police violence has emerged as an urgent public health issue, which continues to devastate communities across the U.S. And thus, it's an essential focus for this course examining the intersection of the criminal justice system and public health. So not only are we grappling with the effects of police violence and brutality on populations, as we've read in our readings and for this week, we're also having to deal with the impact on toxic stress that's experienced by communities that are poor and marginalized, and the consequences that it has had on the health of mental health of communities, as well as the impact of what we're seeing in terms of the harmful policing practices that have had harmful effects on police officers themselves. And so I'm really pleased to have the honor to introduce our panel who'll be discussing this topic with us this evening. Ms. Kat Brooks is a KPFA co-host of Upfront, and I've heard that show, and I'm so excited because I'm going to be tuning in. She's a longtime performer, organizer, and activist. She's played a central role in the struggle for justice for Oscar Grant, and has spent the last decade working with impacted communities and families to rapidly respond to the violence of police practices and radically transform the ways our communities are police incarcerated. She's the co-founder of the Anti-Police Terror Project, known as APTP, and the executive director of the Justice Teams Network. Kat was also a mayoral candidate in Oakland's 2018 election, facing incumbent Libby Schaaf. Next, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Alan Caesar, and I want to note our typo in the name card. It's actually PhD, not MD. Dr. Caesar is a veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces, an activist and scholar who is currently the Chief Science Officer of Plantation's Innovation Lab, with a focus on cannabis, on cannabis and patient advocacy and healing justice. Dr. Caesar studies the impact of cannabis use on the psychological well-being, life satisfaction, stress reactivity, and mindfulness using techniques like monetary assessment and neural imaging. Dr. Caesar has completed his undergrad training at the University of Maryland, University College, his master's and doctoral work at Washington University in St. Louis, and his postdoc training at Stanford School of Medicine, where he was awarded a postdoc fellowship at the Stanford Neuroscience Institute. Dr. Caesar's activism is focused on the intersectional activism, building peace, and is centered on healing trauma to build power for marginalized people and communities. Ms. Melissa Nold is a civil rights attorney focused primarily on excessive force and police misconduct cases. She is licensed to practice in both California state and federal courts. Before becoming a lawyer, Ms. Nold was a law clerk for the law offices of John Burris for 3 years while attending law school. Prior to law school, Ms. Nold was employed as a deputy sheriff coroner, in addition to being a real estate broker, investment consultant, and a small business owner. Ms. Nold is the mother of 5 daughters and enjoys traveling along the California coastline. She spends much of her free time writing and is currently writing 2 books, one autobiographical and one fictional. Ms. Nold received her law degree from University of California, Hastings, and a bachelor's in rhetoric from University of California, Berkeley. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I want to give everyone a great opportunity just to talk about themselves and really explain to us like how you got to this point, what brought you here in your work, and we have time to do so. And then afterwards, when each of you have done that, we'll have a segment for Q&A.
I'm Melissa Nold. As you said, I sort of started off, I guess, my journey to where I'm at as a police officer. Was deputy sheriff for Napa County for not very long. Walked off in the middle of the shift after having seen some things that upset my spirit and the treatment of some of the vulnerable members of the community out there. I left, went into some other works with the intention to come back and go to law school at some point. After the real estate market crashed, it was time to go back to school, finish up what I wanted to do, which was ultimately do civil rights work. I've always wanted to be a civil rights attorney. Began that journey, had an opportunity early on in my first year of law school to go and intern with John Burris, who does kind of the heavy hitter doing civil rights work in the Bay Area. I fell in love with the work. I fell in love with the community of impacted people. Began to immediately realize that things were even worse than I understood them to be as a police officer, and began to really see the impact on the family and the community at large, the PTSD that we were seeing in our client bases, and started to realize that what I thought I was doing, becoming an attorney, in civil rights work, was also making me do work as a psychotherapist, as a counselor, as a friend. I really, to this day, probably do 50% what we call client management, which really is mental health management, trying to make sure that people are getting the resources they need to deal with the traumas that they've experienced because of police-related issues. Many of the people in our client base were witnesses to the murders of their family members. Some of them, due to the mental health issues of their family members, maybe even called the police to facilitate getting mental health treatment in 5150s, and the guilt that comes along with being the person that tried to get help, that resulted in someone's harm. Watching more recently, as I started doing more hands-on advocacy work in Vallejo, seeing the impact of the families that have been further traumatized by the police through intimidation and things like that, that have sort of created this tension in the community and almost like a PTSD response for a lot of the vulnerable communities when they see the police. And made me realize that we have real deficiencies in our communities of this particular community, Vallejo in particular, and all the cities, of how we're dealing with the mental health aspects of policing. Because I'm a lawyer, I can do litigation, I can sue people, but what's being done to make sure that people are getting back to, to being able to function so that they're no longer afraid of the police. And so kind of why I'm here is we're working on trying to hope that people that want to be practitioners are realizing that these traumas are not necessarily just the family members, of course, the impact of the direct family members, but the broader community, people's friends and families and neighbors have been killed. Just a couple months ago, a man was shot and killed in Vallejo, and we went onto the crime scene at the time and just as observers, and there's hundreds of people that are observing the death of community members laying out on the ground and watching law enforcement disrespect his remains and degrade him. And it's, it shakes everyone that's there. And when we're in there in circles of community members staring at people that have harmed us, there's nobody there. There's no mental health professionals. There's no people to talk to. There's no people to, to do the things that are necessary to allow the community to heal. So hoping that, that you guys may be some of those healers in the future, and to see that it's a dense problem, and it's impacting the youth. I personally have a number of clients whose small children have witnessed police violence, and they can't be raised carefree like other children can. They have terror. They see the police coming down the street, even though they're doing no wrong, they're in terror. They're scared that they're going to come back. They're going to take, if the police took your uncle, there's, your dad, they're going to come take your mom. And, there's this just continuous anxiety and tension in the community that somebody really needs to address. And instead, we spend hours and hours trying to fill the gap for some of those things, and just hoping that some of the mental health professionals that are people aspiring to be will want to take on that burden, because it's intense. It's very, very intense. But it's necessary. It's necessary for all of us to to realize that things we see on the news are impacting more than just one or two people. Every death shakes the community in ways that are traumatic, and we're just trying to work on solutions. So that's kind of why I'm here. That's my input on it.
I think I'll start with my background a little bit. So my PhD is in cognitive neuroscience. I spent that time focusing on understanding the neural mechanisms of complex cognition, so like problem solving, strategy, and also to understand that in the context of a clinical population. So I studied individuals with psychosis, and individuals with psychosis, in addition to symptoms like hallucinations and delusions, they have deficits of cognition that make it difficult for them to function. And there's some treatments for some of the symptoms, positive symptoms of psychosis, like hallucinations and delusions. But there really weren't a lot of treatments developed that could help people regain some of their cognitive abilities. And that has kind of a longer term impact on their ability to function, because they can't work as well if they have desires to go to school. It's also challenging. So I spent a lot of time doing kind of theoretical work around that topic, really understanding this thing, trying to understand kind of the scope of the illness and how it relates to biology. But I was not really satisfied with that, and was kind of getting vibes from academia that there was really no interest in applying some of the information that's learned from these studies. And my spirit was calling me to do that, basically. It's hard to study people who are suffering, so significantly without, doing any kind of work to ameliorate some of that suffering. So my postdoc work at Stanford, I focused on developing cognitive remediation tools, basically clinical interventions that were targeted based on, dissertation work and stuff like that. And that was closer to what I was interested in, but I was also starting to run into a lot of issues in academia. As a Black academic, you don't, get the kind of support that you need to be successful, to say the least, and you don't get the same kind of mentorship. And also, I was a co-president of the Black Postdocs Association, and I noticed that a lot of people, Black postdocs, marginalized communities in academic spaces, were just kind of being abused, by those spaces. And so I started thinking about, the effect of stress on these individuals related to toxic stress that marginalized communities experience. And then also thinking about the relationship between stress and psychosis. So there's a study done in Britain. They were looking at some of the factors that contributed to higher rates of onset for psychosis. And they found that living in a city was associated with increased risk for developing psychosis. And they're like, well, what is it about the city that increases risk? And then they found that immigrants had a higher rates of psychosis. And they were like, well, why is it that immigrants have higher rates of psychosis? They thought that there was a prejudice in diagnosing, right? So they had a lot of the immigrants were from the Caribbean, so they flew in doctors from some of these home countries and then had them do the diagnosis again, and they found that they were being diagnosed accurately. So they dove a little bit deeper into which immigrants are being impacted, and they found like the more easily you are identified as an immigrant, the higher your rates of developing psychosis. So and that was due to a lot of the racism and discrimination that people experience. It had an impact on your physiology. That's one thing I studied in thinking about the origins of psychosis. Like, how do people get psychosis? What are some of the factors that contribute? As your brain is developing, the neurodevelopmental hypothesis, and as your brain is developing, if you're exposed to adverse events, social isolation, maternal separation, childhood adversity, it changes your dopamine sensitization. and you have basically an exaggerated response to stressors of the environment. So then I was like, well, what, I'd gone through grad school, 4 or 5 years, and never really thought about it, and never really had any faculty that would think about these things. But what is the impact of being a Black person in America on, psychosis rates? So, and basically found that Black people had 4 times higher rates of being diagnosed with psychosis. Is there a study that has definitively said that that's because of racism? No, but I don't really need to read that study to know that some of the abuses that people experience on a daily basis impact their physiology and long-term health outcomes. So I left the academia and the work that I was doing and started working in the cannabis industry and doing research basically on the relationship between cannabis use and its health effects. And doing so, I learned about the endocannabinoid system. Does anyone know what that is? Show of hands. Do you want to give it a shot explaining?
It's something I had learned in undergrad. And I'm not gonna go fast.
Yeah. Okay. So this is important. That actually these are public health scholars here. So the endocannabinoid system. So THC was first isolated in the 70s, and then because they were trying to understand what impact the THC molecule has on the human body, they would tag it and look to see kind of what happens when it enters our system. And they found that it was binding to a particular set of receptors, and that there was this whole system in the body that consists of different ligands and proteins and receptors. And that is essentially what THC and molecules in the cannabis plant was interacting with. So they looked at, well, what's the point of this system? What does it actually do? And they found that at the cellular level, these receptors and these ligands basically regulate cellular activity. So in the brain, for neurons, you have neuronal transmission. And when there's excessive excitation, an increase in excitation, the endocannabinoid system basically downregulates that excitation. And when there's excessive inhibition, then the endocannabinoid system essentially downregulates that excessive inhibition. So it basically maintains homeostatic regulation at the cellular level. So we have this system. What causes endogenous cannabinoids? Your body produces certain cannabinoids naturally, right? The system exists for a reason. So what are some of the behaviors and actions that produce natural release of endogenous cannabinoids? Well, there are things like, some foods do it, chocolate, herbs and teas, but there are also some, behaviors, and the behaviors are basically anything that reduces stress, social interaction, unstructured playtime, produces endogenous release of endocannabinoids. Exercise, but only if the exercise is wanted. If you're enjoying the exercise, then there'll be endogenous release of endocannabinoids. But if you're not, your endocannabinoid system essentially treats it as stress. That's pretty amazing. And when I think about why people use cannabis and what sort of cannabis does to the stress system, it suggests that there might be people out there who either are exposed to greater stressors or who have greater reactivity to stress, right? So it could be the case that trauma, the experience of trauma, which has lasting impacts on stress levels and stress reactivity, but might predispose someone for using cannabis. And so that's kind of the research that we're doing right now to look at the relationship between early exposure to stress and trauma and cannabis use and also stress reactivity. But we know from our research that cannabis use basically is associated with mindfulness. So the longer you've been using cannabis, we found that you have greater experience of mindfulness, which people know mindfulness here. Yes. So, and then also there's significant differences between people who use cannabis and people who don't use cannabis in terms of the level of mindfulness experiences that they have over the course of a day. So the relationship between the endocannabinoid system, endogenous cannabinoids, things that produce natural release, or basically a reduction of stress levels, and the use of exogenous cannabinoids or phytocannabinoids from the cannabis plant for people who might, have experienced trauma or have elevated levels of stress. This epidemic, which, it's not a new epidemic, but something that people are now recognizing as an epidemic of toxic stress, kind of all intersected. So we have a shop in Vallejo, and my bosses are pretty involved in the politics of the town. I mean, they have to basically fight for their existence as a cannabis company in this town because it works well for some and not for others for strange reasons. But we hear about the shootings of unarmed Black people, and it affects customers as they're coming in. Our checks are on a first-name basis with them. So when we're thinking about basically the relationship between cannabis and stress and the importance of the endocannabinoid system. It drives us to basically make mechanisms of homeostatic return, right? Things that allow people to de-stress, basically have lower stress and less toxic stress. We want to make these things more accessible, working with the community in response to police violence, which is an issue in Vallejo, is kind of a no-brainer for us. So the question is, how can we use our expertise and experience to basically allow for this community to have the resources it needs to heal itself in the ways that it wants to, right? Healing is not something that can be forced upon individuals, just like we can't force exercise to reduce stress. I think we're interested in facilitating kind of bottom-up power building, essentially, where people can kind of reclaim their ability to heal themselves and have access to the things that allow them to be healed and also be removed from situations where they're being exposed to chronic stress, including police terror, police violence.
I don't have big words like that. What I'm going to say, write stuff down and go look it up later. How y'all doing?
Good.
Come on. I'm from the town. How y'all doing?
Great.
All right. So my name is Kat Brooks. I'll get into how I got here and my background, but I am the co-founder of the Anti-Police Terror Project. The dash is between police and terror, not anti-police. That's important. You see why, particularly when you're on FBI watch lists, that we need to make those clarifications. And then I always want to talk about why we call it terror, right? We don't call it violence. We don't call it brutality. We call it terror because our communities are literally being terrorized. And Webster's dictionary loosely defines it. This is a loose repetition of it. But by terrorism, the use of force to impose a political will or agenda on another community. And when you look at the history of law enforcement in this country, law enforcement were born out of both as slave catchers and also to crush burgeoning labor movements. And so their job from jump was to protect white power structure and capitalism and ensure that there were Black people and Indigenous people and poor people consistently on the bottom, making profit for the few that are on the top. That was their job then. That is their job now. We do not believe that policing can be fixed. It's not broken. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. People talk about we can fix policing, and I say, so should we go back to 1952? Is that when it was working right? Or 1912? Is that when it was working right? There's no place that we can go back to and say, oh, in this scenario, police were actually protecting and serving all of us, right? They've always protected and served capital interests. So this is important before I get to start talking. So I was actually born in Las Vegas, Nevada, which y'all think of Las Vegas and you think of casinos and lights and all this other stuff. It was a very small town. You could get anywhere in town in 10 minutes. It was in the middle of the desert, and it's where the term 86 comes from. You all think of 86 being kicked out because you get too rowdy in a bar or they figure out your ID was fake. No, 86 in Vegas meant 8 miles out and 6 feet deep, and that's where the cops took niggers who got out of line. That's where that term comes from. And so that really, and Vegas also, I have to explain it, was very segregated. So all the black people lived on this side and all of the white people lived on that side. My mother was white and my father was black. And so I got a very early education, right, in what those two sides of town look like. And so I grew up with a very particular ideology of police and their role in community growing up, right? To top that off, my father had a substance abuse problem, and rather than getting him the help that he needed, he ended up, he was harassed by police forever, so I've got tons of memories of him being pulled over and him coming home for having been beat up by police, going to jail after he beat up police, and ultimately he ended up in the correctional facilities in Nevada. And even at that young age, at the age of 8, I was really clear that my daddy was sick and that what he needed was help, not a cage, right? And so that was another, as I look back on like how I got here, that was another piece for me of looking at the carceral system and the carceral state as something that does harm and does not actually help. My mother was very political. And so in a town that had no politics, I was raised in a political home and grew up really understanding that my job was to be of service to the world. I wanted to be an actress, ancestors intervened, and I started organizing in Los Angeles from, I think I was about 21. I moved there to be an actress and ended up working for an organization called Community Coalition, formed by now Congresswoman Karen Bass in the heart of South Central, which has its own very serious issues with police and policing. And worked on a bunch of issues there. We worked on land use, and we worked on folks coming home from what I call American concentration camps, prisons. Worked on education, ensuring that all kids were getting the A to G requirements that they needed. And a little bit on police and policing. There was a young 14-year-old kid that was shot 60 times by the LAPD because he stole a car. And so did some organizing around that. But still my primary focus was sort of on education. And then, and Black liberation work. So in my spare time, I was working with grassroots, not nonprofits, but grassroots organizations doing Black liberation work. And got pulled up to Oakland to do the education work to replicate what we had done in Los Angeles, and was working also with the Black August Organizing Committee, which was founded by George Jackson, and people now, they get labeled in the prisons now as BGF, but they're a Black political organization inside of America's prisons. And so I was doing that work, and I went home for Christmas to see my family, and I was driving back, and I remember I was on the corner of where I lived, getting ready to pull into the parking lot. My daughter at the time was 2, and this brother pulled me over, or waved me down at the light, and he said, "Hey sister, do you know where that rally is at?" And I was like, "What rally?" And he was like, "That rally for the brother they shot." And I was like, "What brother?" Because even just one state over, there was no news about the fact that the BART police had executed Oscar Grant at 12:01 on January 1st, 2009. Not a peep about that, not a peep about the immediate rebellions that happened. And then here's where I have to stop, because I see some younger faces. Does everybody know who Oscar Grant is? No. The first time that happened to me, I was at UC Santa Cruz. It was our freshman class, and I was like Oscar Grant, and nobody knew who he is, and that's fine. And the thing that saddens me about that is that part of why you don't know who Oscar Grant is because there are so many names that have come after him. So Oscar Grant was a young man. He lived in Oakland, and he wanted to go to San Francisco to party for New Year's Eve. And his mother, Wanda Johnson, suggested he take the BART because she thought it'd be safer. And so Oscar and his friends went over to the city, and they were coming back, and it was just after midnight. Some shit popped off on the train. BART police were called. Oscar and his friends were pulled off of the train. Oscar, in a matter of minutes, was called a bitch-ass nigger, slammed to the ground, handcuffed, and shot in the back. The officer that killed him was Johannes Metzgerly. He was ultimately arrested, largely due to the organizing work that we did. So a lot of people look at, and those are my sisters, Patrice and Alicia, as Black Lives Matter being the jump off point for this iteration of work. And it actually wasn't. The jump off for this decade of work was the work that was happening in Oakland, 2009 through 2012, around the struggle for Oscar Grant. We literally had thousands of people in the streets. Ultimately, they had to move the trial of Johannes Messerly and because to LA, and then we just co-organized with LA. And then so we were just working with organizers there and flying back and forth. And ultimately, Johannes Messerly became the first police officer in the history of the state of California to be arrested, convicted, and sent to prison for killing one of our people. And now, mind you, he didn't get charged with murder. He got charged with, Melissa, you're going to correct me on the term. He got it's involuntary manslaughter. I kept wanting to say unintentional. And as I say in the one-woman show that I have, can you tell me what's involuntary about handcuffing somebody and shooting them in the back? Because if I handcuffed Melissa and I shot her in the back, no questions asked, I'm going to prison for life, right? And not that that matters, but Oscar was unarmed. So that's who Oscar is. And I hadn't heard anything about it. And so I went upstairs and turned on social media. And there it was, this video, this execution of this baby all over social media. And when I talk about that moment, I talk about it a lot as not enough moment. Something in me shifted. You know, you've had moments in your life where you know that nothing is ever gonna be the same again. The person you were before that particular moment is gone. And for me, that was that moment. The person I had been before then was gone. I had had enough. I was just done. And as Black people, we live to Alan's point, we live with so much trauma and so many stressors that like if we actually sat inside of the shit that we go through every single day, we would all be in psychosis. Just to be able to function, we have to shut that out. And it was like Oscar's murder obliterated my ability to do that anymore. And it was like a tsunami. And I screamed and cried and threw up. And I remember holding my daughter and trying to pull it together because she's, of course, I'm screaming, she's screaming. And I wanted to do something. And so there was a coalition that had formed. I should mention, my Tiny Community Coalition was as an organizer, so I'm a trained organizer, is what I do. There was a coalition that had formed called CAPE, the Coalition Against Police Executions. And it was a bunch of nonprofits that had gotten together. And so I went, was a communication specialist and an organizer, and I was like, what can I do? So I just started doing media for them and building out that strategy and writing press releases. And that was really my entree into the work. And then Kate fell apart after 3 weeks, and we had a long way to go. And so we formed the Coalition for Justice for Oscar Grant, and we organized our asses off for 3 years. We held protests, we shut shit down, we did all kinds of stuff. And out of that work was born the first organization that I co-founded, which was called the Onyx Organizing Committee. And our intention when we founded Onyx was that we wanted it to be really a Black liberation organization and to really focus on all of the ways in which war is waged on Black bodies in this country. And we tried to do political education, we tried to focus on feeding folks, we tried to do everything, but invariably the state kept killing us. Like we couldn't get good into any other program enough to actually get it off the ground. And mind you, these are unpaid, right? We all had day jobs. So we had our 9 to 5, this was our 5 to midnight. We couldn't get off the ground because the state kept killing us. And so the protest after protest after protest after protest, and back then, literally they could kill somebody, you know, on Monday, and we'd have 2,000 people on the streets of Oakland on Tuesday. The Oakland Police Department used to kill 7 to 10 people every single year. They've killed 1 since 2015. And it's not because they had a change of heart. It's because we built a movement in that city that let them know that we were gonna hold them accountable. So at a certain point, it was after a protest, and we were in my kitchen, and my comrade said, I just want to use her exact word, bruh, I feel like we're chasing dead Black bodies. I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, we keep having all these protests, but these motherfuckers keep killing us. So what are we doing? And so that led to an extended conversation wherein we asked ourselves several questions. One was, why are we only moving when the state moves? state violence happens every single day. When they kill us is the most extreme version of that violence, but we are terrorized by law enforcement in our communities every single day. So why are we moving here? 2, what does it look like to be visionary and not just reactionary? Like, what if we can stop the violence before it happens in the first place? Okay, well, how do we do that? Well, all the data shows that the only thing that reduces police violence against our communities is less interaction. So what does it look like to start building up alternatives to police violence so that our people don't have to engage with them as much? 4, what happens to the families, right? So then the tradition, for lack of a better word, was really, the community would hear about one of these murders. Some well-meaning activist like me would slap their loved one's face on a billboard or a poster, and we'd be out in the streets screaming their loved one's name and never having had a conversation with the families. Wanda Johnson didn't make a public appearance for almost 2 years, right? Which is how, that's a longer story. But, and also us being clear that we hear about this on the news for, if it's a big case, right, a couple weeks. But more often it's a day or 2. But for these families, not only is the legal process forever, the trauma is forever. They're never going to be the same again. And so what does it look like to work with families and empower them and give them the resources that they need? So that was the birth of the Anti-Police Terror Project. And our first committee was the First Responders Committee. And we wanted to be able to respond to police violence when it happens in our communities ourselves. One of the issues, part of the trauma, is that this thing just keeps happening to us, and we just feel like there's nothing we can do. And so we started responding. Like when we found out about the police murdering somebody, we started responding, and we respond with healing modalities and vigils, and then we identified the families, and then we found lawyers to work with. We do pro bono legal support, and eventually we have a model. And I actually brought it. It's the First Responders model. It's the only one of its kind in the country, as far as we know. It's being replicated throughout the state and in parts of so-called Canada. We've developed alternatives to policing. There's places in Oakland where our security teams actually are the first people that folks call instead of law enforcement. We just launched a response to mental health in the city of Sacramento. We've been working on policy because even though we are clear that policing can't be fixed, we also understand that there's a genocide happening in this country, and it's got to be all roads in. We need the legal part, we need the organizing part, and we need the policy part. So we were co-sponsors on the bill that recently just changed the use of force law in the state of California for the first time in 100 years. We were co-sponsors on the bill that made information available to families that have been under lock and key, and to communities, because historically what happened was the police killed Mary, let's say, and in Oakland, and then very quietly to Vallejo. And there are actually several OPD cops that we are very sorry that we sent this way. But nobody would ever know because all of their records were quiet. Because while California has, California law enforcement agencies kill more people than any other state in the country. And they also have, the Peace Officers Bill of Rights, or POBRA is actually what it is, the most protections of their secrecy and persons of any other law enforcement body of agencies in the country. So they are able to move and kill with impunity and almost without detection. So that's me, that's our work. And then so ultimately we formed the Justice Teams Network, and the Justice Teams Network is a statewide entity. I formed it with Patrice Cullors of Black Lives Matter. And we have 9 anchor organizations across the state that we support with communications training, working with the Justice Coalition of Vallejo, who's our most recent anchor org. And we do communications work, we do policy, we do organizing, and always family support.
Thank you so much, each of you, for providing us, all the information about what you're doing currently in the community. And I want to open it up for students who have questions, for anyone, participants, our community, questions for you. I have a few questions, but I would like to give you all the opportunity first. So please, if you have questions for our guests. this is a great time to. Elizabeth?
I have a little question on, I don't know if I understood correctly, California has the highest protection for law enforcement. I guess that's really alarming.
Yeah, we think we live in a progressive bubble.
Yeah.
But no, the Peace Officers Bill of Rights affords the protections of law enforcement officers, rights that people like you and me would never get. So for instance, if a police officer is going to be interrogated about a crime, he has to know when, he has to know who, he has to know what, he or she. They have a right to record the interaction. They can't be cussed at or threatened. So just imagine, like, if when they pull in our folks, but if they literally could not cuss or threaten them. I mean, that's just the smallest piece. But like the personal information, the records, all of that stuff is protected by the Peace Officers Bill of Rights and the Copley decision, which you can research. But a newspaper outlet tried to get information about law enforcement that had done something in court, but I can't remember. And they lost in the U.S. Supreme Court that, you know, police, the professional records are protected.
So they're probably more protected than some of the, like, the red states.
They're the most protected law enforcement agencies in the country, or in California. We have the strictest. The other states have some version of POBRA, but we have the strongest version of that exists anywhere in the nation.
How can that possibly be changed, or?
So we're working on it. The SB 1421 that I was talking about, like that now it's a crack. So we're looking at things like that. The use of force policy, that's a crack. And so what we finally got hip to is like trying to cancel out the whole thing because of how powerful the police officers' lobby is in this state. You'd be shocked to know how deep their hands are in just about every single state legislator's pocket that is up there, even your most progressive ones. That the way that we are chipping away at it is like policy, legislative season at a time.
And one of the issues too is there's a huge information deficit about what's actually going on in policing and what people actually know. And so they've protected all this information so long to keep the general public from having any idea of what's going on. I mean, they control, even when, for example, Kat was talking about how you go in for an interview, shot and killed a man. They're allowed to review the evidence. They're allowed to review their camera footage and all those things so that they can craft. I mean, imagine if I murdered Alan, and I would be allowed to have an attorney, but certainly they would allow me to reveal evidence against me before I give a statement. And so they have all of these things that are created to allow them to get away with murder, literally things that under the law are first degree murder sometimes. And then the next step is that they take the information about what happened and they create a press release, which goes into the newspaper. That's a one-sided defense for this officer who's been allowed to create this whole thing, but nobody realizes any of that. So we all live in this deficit, even about things that are happening in our community. I mean, there was a man shot and killed 2 years ago named Ronell Foster. When he was killed, the police put out a narrative that they were looking for him for domestic violence, that he'd raised up a weapon and was going to go attack the officers. So years later, we finally get to see the footage of what actually happened, and this man's crawling away and was being shot in the back unarmed. But that's not what was told to us, and so the system is set up in major ways to create this deficit so that when you do have people that are shouting and protesting, you go, what's wrong with these people? What are they mad about? They're just mad because some criminal's dead. No, there's this whole network of things that keep the general public from even knowing that the police have these protections. We don't realize that the state is murdering people because the system is set up to prevent you from knowing that, and educated people that, we're in a room full of people that don't know who Oscar Grant is. And I know that, that's the information deficit, because that was something that within certain communities rocked those communities. This is a murder that we all saw, one of the first ones that everybody saw, because now we have cell phones. So that deficit is really part of the problem. And so part of that is making sure that you guys realize, it's kind of a go off topic, when you read a news article about a police incident, just know that that's a one-sided version. That police officer's attorney essentially has narrated how to try to get away with murder. And then by the time you read the story, oh, this bad guy, something bad happened to him, we don't even care anymore. You know, they do all of this to quell the public outrage and to prevent us from rising up and taking control of our communities. So just wanted to give that background when you start going out and being mindful of these things and you see these things. Just know, even what you read in the newspaper, these newspapers might be credible, but that information isn't. Oftentimes we find out years later that lies have been told to conceal murders, and nobody's being held responsible. So it's just an information deficit to be mindful of for yourselves, to look further into it. So when you see something that's happened, look into some of these incidents, and wait 6 months later, recall these names, look later when they release the videos, and then go back and look at what they said initially. And you look at the video and you're going, they're not even talking about the same thing. So all of this is being done to keep us quiet about the murder of our neighbors and friends. And it's just something that we should all be mindful, particularly the health professionals who you guys are going to all be in a position to have powerful voices as educated people, and people who want to listen to you more. And we listen to me, particularly, to become a lawyer. So as you rise up in the ranks of the educated folk, you guys are going to have the ability to educate and inform people about some of these information deficits that will help them understand what communities around them are suffering from.
I just had a question. So do any of you know why is that the California Law Enforcement Agency has all of this protection compared to like all the other states in the United States? Like why? How did that happen?
Yeah, I was wondering, I was going to ask you actually, is it because it's been challenged more often than it would be in a red state?
No, and I don't know the history of PROGRA. I just know what it is. That's actually something interesting to figure out. I don't know. I don't know why. It's just the way the legislation got crafted.
It's a powerful union. The police union is one. How many unions do you know where the members of the union all carry guns? It used to be that, in mob days, like the Teamsters and things like that, these might be like burly, buff guys, and you might be scared of them, but they're not armed and allowed to kill you. A lot of people don't realize, like, I quietly litigated for years before I started loudly litigating. And as soon as I did, I started getting threats, death threats. I've gotten physically intimidated by one of our patrol lieutenants in Vallejo. In the last 6 months, I've had 3 separate incidents from the command staff of Vallejo PD trying to intimidate me and to get me to stop talking about dead, vulnerable people. And so when you have a union that's strong enough to allow the intimidation of officers of the court and nobody to stop it, you realize how powerful that union is. But it is because the people that are members of these police unions are the entire police department. And these are armed, scared guys. And so that's a lot of what the power comes from. And so when it comes to the local city council people, mayors, legislators, that's scary people. And honestly, there's a lot of intimidation even from, you want that particular group of scary guys to be on your side. And it's not because you love the police, it's because they might come shake you down. They might come to your house, they might threaten you. And these are things historically, there's a long history of police intimidation of public figures, city council people. Even in Vallejo, with the history of high-ranking members of the police department intimidating city council people. And it's not even very well hidden. And so that's something.
They're not unions; they're associations.
They're
unions are good things. They don't represent labor.
Yeah, they absolutely. I should say quasi
labor.
Yeah, I usually refer to them as a quasi union. They operate in the same way because they have the same ability to gather, but it's not for the same purpose.
I mean, they call themselves unions.
Yeah, they call themselves unions.
As organizers in the movement, we don't
it's not a traditional friends. Yeah, it's not a traditional. Like my dad is, was operating engineer. He was in the labor union. That's a union. Those are people that have joined together for the betterment of working conditions for things. That's not their situation. They're there to shake down and intimidate the community.
Well, then they stay powerful because politricksters take their money and then do their bidding.
Yeah, you get police, everybody that's running for office takes endorsements. The police endorsement, and every endorsement, whether it's the district attorney, the city council, the mayor, they all take endorsements and money from these unions. And then they ultimately make decisions. There's a lot of things that are legal they don't seem like they should be. And so, you know, those are some of the factors that could control it. It's always the money, you know, like everything else. You follow the money. They have the money, you know, because there are a lot of people with a lot of money that want to maintain the status quo. You know, they want to keep their foot on people. And so they use, you know, there's a lot of funding that's put into that, and it's, you know, it's, like Kent said, it's not broken. This is how it was built. You know, this is how it was meant to operate.
I'm gonna say the murders are the worst, you know, outcome. But there's a lot of violence that happens that never makes it, you know, to the light of day. There's a backlog of complaints, you know, about the police that just never gets resolved. A lot of people who've experienced violence from the police, they, other than this complaint system, there might not be any recourse for them to kind of have their stories heard.
Sexual assault is actually the primary way women of color experience police violence.
We had a question from William.
How you doing? This is more geared towards Ms. Knoll. My experience with law, limited as it's been, it's very, it's simultaneously conservative and reactionary entity. And I know, like, for example, Mr. Burris has won numerous lawsuits, right, that result in settlements for the families or for the victims themselves. And I'm wondering how, like, civil rights law can be rendered as a tool that affects structural change, right? Because Vallejo, there's been a lot of lawsuits against BPD, and there's going to, before the end of the year, there's going to be another murder on their hands, like guaranteed. I think about Detective Sean Kenny, who has killed 3 people and has been involved in 5 shootings. And by any definition of the word, 6. By any definition of the word, a serial killer sometimes killed 3 people. Now, Sean Kenny's a serial killer, and rather than being put in jail or punished, he was promoted to detective. And that's a strange thing in Vallejo. But I'm wondering, all that to say, how do we render it so we can affect structural change?
Well, so from my standpoint, there are things that are tools available through the court to compel them to make policy changes and things like that. The history just hasn't been going straight forward and going to trial and making these things happen. The courts are set up, most of this is happening in federal courts. The federal court encourage settlement, financial settlement of cases early. And so 95% of cases settle. There's money exchanged, but then nothing is done to affect the systemic problems. One of the things we did as a result of and it's hard, don't be wrong, the courts make it very difficult for you to show that the city itself is responsible, and not just an individual rogue officer. And so you have to get to a city like Vallejo where it's gotten so bad that you can show through numerous incidents that this systemic problem is a result of the city's negligence, and that can allow us to be in a position to force them to change. When Willie McCoy got shot, that was something personally I wanted to compel forward. We were waiting for a case that had certain factors that we thought that the court would allow us to go forward on. And so we were kind of testing a theory of not just that they have an excessive force problem, but it's actually a supervision problem. They're not watching their employees because they're getting away with little things. And ultimately, if you get away with, with not charging your phone, ultimately you continue to do worse and worse and worse. And some people are to the point of getting away with murder. And so we're now with some of the litigation that's going on is actually aiming at the city's continuous negligence and to try to compel the federal court to intervene in some way, or for them to agree, sort of like what ultimately happened in Oakland, where there's an outside person that's actually looking at different incidents. So it's not just the police policing themselves. There's another stop with another human being that can say, this is wrong. Like, for example, there was a man named Joshua Pollock who was murdered in Oakland when he was sleeping. And the chief, everybody, they were like, he was a good shoot. Officers did nothing wrong. That oversight person that went back and said no and recommended every one of those officers for termination. And so getting something like that in place for Vallejo would be life-saving the way it has been in Oakland. I mean, I've done one Oakland case in 8 years, and I've done 18 Vallejo cases in that same period of time. And so we're hoping to now use those tools to create a situation where we can get closer to what's going on in Oakland with courts and have some other person that's going to be looking out for them, rather than just right now they're only policing themselves. And the only stop gap above that is a district attorney, and she takes money from the police unions too. And so, that outside person has been, between what's been going on in the community to every time to rise up every time something happens, you also have an additional person that's looking. So we're hoping that we can get past the point where, money fixes nothing. It doesn't resolve the family's grief, doesn't bring the person back. But those changes are incredibly meaningful. So we're hoping to get to the point where we're no longer suing people for money and get to the point where we can stop having to sue for money and get to the point where we can actually say that, like what happened in Oakland, where you go from 7 to 10 murders a year to 1 in several years. I mean, that's the goal. At least for me, that's the goal in litigation. There's still gonna be people that are out for a money grab, but I for people that have to live in these communities and embrace the victims, like for me, I have to work on the fixing part of it. So there's a way. It's difficult, and they hire extremely expensive attorneys to fight back, against us. But we're things are changing in that respect. I think for the litigation, that it's no longer driven just to get people financial compensation, but the understanding that you need to stop the problem. So.
Do you think could or should be the role of the city council to address some issues?
Well, I mean, like for example, in Vallejo, we have a city council who hires and fires the city manager. The city manager hires and fires the chief of police. They have to be not the mouthpiece for, for the liability of the city. They're supposed to be the mouthpiece for the people. And so when the people are being impacted, they're the ones that should be speaking up and saying this is out of control. This, so that when you have the majority, they can compel the chief of police by way of the city manager. So in a lot of cities, you say, oh, these people have no power. They have all the power. They like to separate themselves out and step back and say, oh, well, it's not me. I just have one vote. Well, that one vote could be to get rid of the city manager who won't get a chief of police who's going to control his employees. So the role of the city council should be much more than what it is. And unfortunately, none of those people have risen to the occasion on that. And in Vallejo, they've actually gone sort of the opposite direction. They've gone to even target me personally as a troublemaker, a rabble rouser for bringing up the murders of my community members. So sometimes the city council is part of the problem. Often, always, probably. Honestly,
It certainly is.
yeah, in Vallejo, yeah.
Well, I have several questions for each of you. So I'm gonna jump in and take my opportunity. So Kat, I was wondering, this as you were describing the way that our police, our law enforcement system has evolved in this country. It was intended to do what it's doing. It's not broken. How do we as groups and individuals, how do we approach these, problems that in terms of law enforcement practices and policies, how do we change it from the outside as public health researchers? And I know, we probably have done our reading and we're aware that the American Public Health Association, as of 2018, has agreed, they've adopted, they have a council on recognizing police violence as a public health issue. It took a lot of work over a number of years, and I was there in 2017 where they voted no. 65% of the people in the room were like, no, we don't want to recognize that. And we were all booing and hissing and disgusted, and I was like, I'm done with APHA after this, but they actually have recognized it as an issue. And I think as a researcher, I hope to be able to actually address the deficiency in the data and the information that's out there. We have a deficit in the data. People are not aware of how many killings are out there. There's so many different organizations that have different numbers, and there's nothing standardized across, like CDC. I have to look at what they have. They would be like what I would think is sort of having that information at the governmental level to look at this epidemic, what's happening to people every single day. And so that's one of the ways I think about it, is like closing that information gap. But then I think about policy and really sort of placing that focus on law enforcement and how it sounds very difficult, as Melissa has stated, in terms of working from a legal framework, within the legal framework, but as policy folks who are interested in public health research and translating that into policy, where do you feel that we can make the biggest difference?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, that APHA conference 2018, they actually invited the Anti-Police Terror Project to come speak. They voted, which for us was like, what is happening in the unit, right? We were just like, we got invited to what? But we've got a wide breadth of folks on our team, including RNs and psychologists who have devoted their lives to this work. And so psychologists for social responsibility has been in deep partnership with us. So I think doing the research is really important, but popularizing that research is even more important. There are so many reports that come out that nobody ever hears about, right? Unless, like on my radio show, I bring them in. We go and work for organizations like the ACLU. Now, not everybody likes the ACLU, but I can tell you, they've done an amazing job of taking their research and then working hand in hand with community to then drive policy that's actually going to change stuff, right? Don't do it on your own. No matter how many degrees you have, if you're not doing your work in partnership with impacted people, your work is bullshit. Sorry. I mean, that's just what is. We can't study our way out of this. We can live our way, experience our way together out of this. I mean, there's all sorts of things that I would like to see. I would like to see, like, in emergency rooms, decriminalized, right? Like, why, as soon as you go into a hospital, the first thing you do is see a police officer. One of the co-founders of APTP, Asantua, in Sacramento, she works in the ER. She works in the ER at UC Davis, and what she talks about is like the consistent traumatization of not just herself, but Black and brown folks that are coming in to be treated. Like, where are the places where the medical field re-traumatizes, re-criminalizes, and works with the state to further harm our communities? Like, that's where I would say I want people to focus. And then what kind of work do you do with organizers and impacted folks to write the policy that needs to be passed?
That's great, thank you. I mean, that is actually the focus of our second class for this concentration is around advocacy. So it's taking our ideas about policy change to the next level and hopefully working with actual people on the ground doing the work. So that's really heartening to know that we are on the right path. I have a question for Dr. Caesar. This ACEs phenomenon, I learned about ACEs about 10 years ago. So adverse childhood experiences, and we all learned about that. Dr. Folletti's landmark article, which I didn't really think about it at the time and how it was really focused on people who maybe weren't as impacted as communities that we think of when we think about ACEs and trauma-informed care. We're thinking about the communities that we serve more locally, historically disadvantaged groups, but at that time it wasn't really something that was part of that study. I wanted to know, like, what's the difference? What do you feel is the difference between ACEs and generational trauma, just right off the bat? Because that ACEs kind of bugs me a little bit.
Yeah, I guess it depends on who's describing it, right? Like, I think the trauma that people experience, I don't think the body distinguishes, between these things. So traumas that the body experiences, have an impact physiologically. If they happen in critical periods when, people are developing that, the trauma is the trauma. So I think a lot of this is really just, academia trying to come up with terminology and a framework that feels okay to engage with this. So I'm not really invested in kind of the terminology. But yeah, I think, what was the rest of the question?
Oh no, just I feel like, we kind of look at ACEs as a model that we can use for screening tools.
So
I
was also going to say, so you were talking about the communities that were used to study this originally, and how that might be different. So there's a screening tool for, have you guys gone over a screening tool for ACEs?
Yeah, in our meetings, we actually have the slides that you recommended, and that was for pediatric care. So I think it would have been a really of interest to our students who are thinking about going into pediatric care, but also it relates to some of the subject matter that they've already learned in their other coursework.
Yes.
And it is also sort of like the buzzword right now, like a lot of the programs are going to be focusing on trauma-informed care using ACEs at the county public health department. And so it's a real interest for divisions like Solano Appeals, Black Infant Health. And so, you know, they're really excited. The programs directors are really, really excited to focus on this. However, obviously, it's you know, and I feel like it's great. I think it's, you know, at least we're doing something and we're recognizing trauma. But then we can also recognize that there are other structural barriers. There's racism. There's implicit bias. There's the implicit biases of the health, you know, sort of apparatus itself, of primary health care delivers. So I think it's a good thing, but I think it's kind of interesting to look at that versus generational trauma that is experienced by impacted people, historically disadvantaged people over so many years.
Right.
And it's like, oh, this new thing ACEs. So it's,
I mean,
it's
the screening tool right now, the common screening tool is like 10 items,
Mhm.
and it is not very in-depth or comprehensive. They're yes/no questions. The screening tool for pediatrics is a little bit more involved, but this is something that we've spoken with about you and Dr. Cummings and Davon, but are these tools adequate for assessing the level of trauma that people from certain communities has experienced? I think, you know, the answer is probably no. I think it would be great to develop a tool, because essentially what you're going to get is ceiling effects. You know, you're going to get people, you know, who have high levels, right? But you won't be able to distinguish between individuals, and it won't be clinically meaningful. So you need something that's a little bit more graded. But I think that just shows where, you know, the field is in terms of understanding ACEs and making connections between a lot of these, like social determinants of health, you know, and some what they're now including in the concept or the framework of ACEs. So I think there's going to be kind of a reckoning in the medical field as this stuff progresses.
And it is fairly new in terms of the focus, the screening tool. 1998 is a study. So I was learning it 10 years later, maybe 12, and so I was like, oh, you know, this is pretty new. And so I agree with you. I think there will be sort of a reset in terms of how it's used. But at the same time, I am heartened by the movement that, you know, people are looking at this not only from public health, but integrating it with care, and especially at how it relates to trauma.
Yeah, I also love the part that, so with toxic stress, you have to talk about some of the vehicles of homeostatic return, right? So when you have increased exposure to stressors, right, what are some of the things that help bring people back down to baseline? There might be medications for that, but there are lots of things that we do naturally, you know, that cause that release of cannabinoids within our body that help bring us back down to baseline. So if you're talking about healing, the question is, like, do people have access to these? Do they have time, you know, to do these things? Is this something that we can't really tell people what to do? You know, the response to toxic stress can't be from the top down; it has to be from the bottom up. And people basically have to have access to resources and liberty to be able to engage with these things that would help them be healthier. But what do those interventions look like? You know, and if there were going to be, you know, if medical institutions were going to be devoting resources to providing things like that, like what does that look like in the community? You know, I mean, I guess it would start with community-based research, participatory research. That's a start, you know. But it's interesting to imagine kind of what that would look like. These resources existing in the environment, people having access to them, they're not being, you know, paywalls behind them the way that there are for a lot of medications and stuff like that.
That would be great. I think that would be a great opportunity for some of our students if they were able to work on projects that were focused on interventions that provided, because it seems like obviously we're taking this new model and we're screening, we're using it, we're weaving it into everything we do as healthcare professionals or public health folks, policymakers, but that's just kind of like assessing the problem. Then what do we do for the community when we have pretty much well established that this is toxic stress that's affecting everybody, and it's starting to affect not people in certain communities, but it's spilling over into other communities, and it's spilling over to people who have never experienced this before. And so that would be really great to see how that can be put in place. But it's similar to also what CAT and APTP is doing in terms of like having a sort of system in place for survivors, for families, for victims, and who have had lost their family due to police murders. And you have a campaign, you have communications, and you have sort of like this really amazing organization that's put together. I was wondering how is APTP funded to do the great work that it does to support the community?
So primarily we are funded through donations by the people. We're not a 501c3, and we did it on purpose because in a lot of movement spaces, nonprofits are not looked upon with grace. And so for the first 3.5 years, first 4 years of APTP, it was mostly everything out of our pocket and donations from folks. And then 2 years ago, we got our first grant. And so not major grants. Most people couldn't live off of what we have in grants, but it helps, right? So if a family member needs their light bill paid, or if get somebody out of jail, or now we have an actual space where people can come and gather, like we have our family dinners. So we've got a place that we can do that. So that was one thing that came out of the advent of Black Lives Matter, was that all of a sudden the work became sexy, and some foundations like to fund the new sexy thing. That took a minute to get those funds to trickle down to folks that were on the ground. But yeah, but we've earned so much love in community that we literally pull in several $100s every single month just on our PayPal. It just dings, almost every day. People give $10. We just got a monthly sustainer of $500 from a white ally. And that's how.
And you've developed a pretty vast network of just allies, people who are working in the organization. So lots of different folks, community activists, nurses, policy people, lawyers. Do you ever work with students who are really motivated to work on grant writing or?
Yep. We haven't figured out how to do paid internships yet, but we do internships, or people just come and they want to study our model and sit with us, and we make that space available. Our mission statement is literally to build a sustainable and replicable model to eradicate and interrupt state terror. So it can't be replicable if we just keep it to ourselves. And we do have a vast network now. I was laughing because we have an annual march on King's Day every year. It's to reclaim MLK's Radical Legacy March, and this was our 6th year. And Assemblymember Rob Bonta asked to come speak. And we let him, and I was laughing. I was like, man, 6 years ago, the word anti-police terror project was a word on the mouths of politicians, and now we're co-sponsors on bills. It just shows you how far, the organizing has come. But we stayed true to our grassroots roots because it's critical for us to remain on the ground. Otherwise, we can't do the work, and we need to be doing the work with the people.
That's really fantastic. We have students who may be interested in interning at a future date, and we don't actually manage paid internships, so it's very rare when our students are offered a stipend, so it's not an issue for our program.
Like, I might be able to raise a stipend, but like,
Yeah.
like I said, we are what's in our bank account is less than half of what most corporates make a year. Get by.
Do we have any other questions for our guests?
I have a question for Kat. You mentioned first responders that aren't police. What does that look like, or what is that program?
So there's so the one I was specifically talking about is called Image First, and it's launched in Sacramento. And no, I've got lots.
Oh, you got lots, okay.
Yeah.
So I will, so I just go ahead and pass it?
You can have that. Here you go. The one I talked about was MH First, and it's completely volunteer, which I think is critical. But they are working with a clinic that has agreed to give them space to work out of and respite for people. They've got 2 very brave physicians that are willing to write prescriptions. The team consists of either an EMT or a nurse, a mental health care professional, as well as a security liaison. The security liaison's job is to be there in case law enforcement does show up, to keep them at bay while they can engage the client, the person. And once they get there, they assess their vitals, figure out is this person really in mental health distress, or is it something that could look like mental health distress, like high blood pressure or something else that could trigger something that resembles psychosis. And once they determine that, then they figure out if this person needs a blanket and a warm place to sit for an hour, or if they need, a little bit longer term care. And so they figure out what a warm handoff looks like. It's phenomenal, the work that they're doing. They recently launched, they've taken in a bunch of calls and done a lot of the work by phone where people are like, I just need to talk to somebody, either the person that was having the difficulty or the family members, because that's the thing, right? Melissa brought this up, the family members don't have anyone else to call. And I have held so many mothers who are like, I didn't know what else to do, and now their loved one is dead. So it's from that and just being able to get practical advice, okay, do this, great distance, to going out on a call. Their very first call that they were very proud of and excited was a trans person of color who was drunk and acting, wilding out, and they were able to get that person to the clinic and some water and a blanket, and he didn't end up in the ER 5150, right? And not only are we talking about saving lives, there's a program in Eugene, Oregon. Now, there's only so much we can take from that program because Eugene, Oregon is 99.99999% white. But it's called Cahoots. And so they are a body of folks that respond to mental health crisis. And I don't have the exact number in front of me, but whatever the cost was, like, to save the city like $23 million or something insane. And so when you think about what we spend on law enforcement responding to every single social ill we have, if we could redirect those resources to investing in things that actually keep us safe, we're saving lives, we're saving money. And then all of a sudden, look, we've got $23 million to, I don't know, fund our schools, etc.
Oh wow, that's so awesome.
I have one last question for Lisa. So, and we kind of talked about this before, and in terms of like protests and making our voices heard about our grievances against the system, and in terms of police killings, I mean, what can we do policy-wise? Like, what are some other ideas that maybe you would have for young people who are thinking about going into policy change from a public health perspective, like garnering that, really sort of like having the evidence-based practices behind us?
One of the biggest things, the biggest portion of the client base are people with mental health problems. People who are not, most of the time, dangerous. They're just not cooperative. And so thinking towards what it would look like to have response, not from the community having to raise up and create first responders, but to have that as a completely separate entity. The police were dealing with violent crimes, robberies, things that you would need an armed person to come to. But then having non-police medical professionals, healers, and that as a route for folks with mental health issues or people that are manifesting those symptoms, because police are not trained to deal with mental health issues. As soon as a person is not cooperating, they're resisting, they're now at risk of death, because that's the tail end of your lack of cooperation with a lot of people who've been physically asphyxiated because they have been mentally ill and non-cooperative, and they're seeing demons and dinosaurs and the things that are going on around in their universe, and not police, they can't comply. And so thinking about policy changes that would create resources for mentally ill people. I mean, you're profoundly more likely to be killed by the police if you're mentally ill. It's not because it's more dangerous, it's just because you don't understand what's going on. Whereas some of these things, I've personally received calls from people who are having issues meeting the police for 5150s. I mean, sometimes people just need to be talked down. Police aren't going to talk you down. They're not going to do this. Have those people, you don't have to be a doctor of any kind. You just have to have the training experience of creating rapport with the person, talking to them, finding out what their support system is. So thinking about taking the mental health community, those people that need help, and taking that out of the criminal justice system. So that's I think where the mental health professionals can look into, to really talking to your council people, talking to your cities. Doesn't have to be statewide. You go city by city, talk to the people, raise your voices up and be heard by people. Say, we need something different. And figure out what they can individually do to support that. Because that's one of the biggest issues. Most people that are killed are not killed because they're almost never. It's the person. People killed by police are almost never committing a violent crime. It's minor, tiny things, and a lot of times it has to do with mental health issues. And some of those mental health issues are just a profound fear of the police. That folks that are, so I think that's something mental health is realizing that those are very distinct things that are all being policed. We don't need to police schizophrenic people for existing. They have a right to exist. They have never have the right to exist in whatever capacity they are without being killed. And so we need to bring in the people that are qualified to handle that instead of bringing in men with guns to handle people that are seeing things.
To that point, I might just say one more thing. So for folks that want to engage in policy work, this round, we actually are introducing statewide legislation through Senator Kamala that would carve out a portion of the state budget to fund 20 pilot programs across the state. That's called the Crisis Act. That would allow us to respond to substance abuse issues, mental health issues, certain natural disasters, interpersonal violence, and there's one more without law enforcement. So that work is actually happening right now. The language has been finalized and will be introed for this next legislative session.
That's exciting. Yes, it's a good question.
Do you know of any sort of people running for office or any kind of government positions that you think are really embodying this view that you have? Like either the president or just in general, like local staff?
Not a president.
Not the current, obviously.
Well, I mean, the only candidate that actually even put out an in-depth criminal justice reform platform was Castro, and he actually tried to meet with some of us in Oakland. I think Bernie could get there. I don't know about people that are currently running. Well, I mean, we just got Chesa Boudin, who I was very proud to endorse. Yes. But people like that sit in state legislatures, so like Holly Mitchell, Senator Kamala Dove, trying to think of Dr. Shirley Weber. There's a brother to him. I can't think of his name. But there's a handful that get it. But the thing with policymakers, just like so when I ran for mayor, and I'm actually getting ready to launch another campaign. The thing is you can't just put people at you can't. Sure, if I do this community asks me to, you can't leave me once I get there, right? So people can run on amazing platforms, but then if we get them into office and then you go on back to your business, it doesn't work. It's got to be an inside-outside strategy. I don't know except for Chesa if anybody's as far left as I am in the political field right now, but there are folks that are getting it, that are finally starting to understand that it's actually not radical when we talk about this genocide happening in this country, like it's data-based, evidence-based. So folks are getting there. For sure.
Another question.
I just had a question. Is there a database that any of you would recommend where we could actually get like statistics and where like accurate statistics on this, or is there even a database like that?
The Guardian had one for a minute, and now the Washington Post.
I mean, statistics on police violence.
Yes, Washington Post.
Washington
database,
Post, yeah, Washington Post has the most up-to-date killings that are happening nationally.
Yeah, that's one of the things we're hoping to do with Toro is collect some data on the extent of exposure to police violence in Vallejo and look at the relationship between that exposure and health outcomes, mental health outcomes. So I'm hoping to get that out there.
Yeah, we're really excited to help write that IRB.
And if you want to know about local stuff, I mean, you know, Google the Vallejo Police Department and, you know, murder, you know, there's literally just tons and tons of information for people who want to get up to speed on what's happening here that you just aren't hearing, you know, you just haven't heard about because they don't want you to.
And I wanted to find out about some of your interventions and programs that you operate through APTP. Are there ways that you look for evaluation, you know, sort of evaluative methods to measure the impacts, things like that? I'm sure you do with like if they're grant funded, but I just wondered like if that's like a regular.
I wish we had that kind of money. We would love to. So all of our data is, I'm not an academic. Which is the one that's not tangible? Qualitative. And so we track that and collect stories and testimonies, you know, or like we can track, for instance, like that federal receiver that Melissa's talking about, he's been in office for 16 years. Oakland carried on with business as usual until the movement hit. So that kind of stuff, but like we are always down if people, that's the way that people want to contribute. Like we would love to have people do data on MH first so that then we can utilize that data.
I can definitely see like that would be a prime area for a student intern, and a lot of our students at the stage where they're going into their field studies, program evaluation and needs assessment, like that's like one of the biggest areas they contribute to with our partnering organizations. So I'm just wondering if that's like a
We would
really
love that because that's necessary, to get more resources for that program, which it desperately needs, but also to be able to talk to other cities and state officials and change policy.
yes,
Like
that's
this,
exactly.
this actually works.
You have your evidence and then equals policy. Let's do it and let's replicate it. So that's fantastic. Will you be at APHA this
No, it will
year?
not be.
And it's going to be in San Francisco.
I'm sure my team is going.
Going to be
I'm sure.
okay. We will be there. The public health faculty will be there because it's so close. We must go. So
You like
we'll get to run into your team members. It'll be really great. Wonderful. Well, I think it's a great place to break if there are no other questions from. Oh, I got one other turn.
Have there been any changes in police training or any intent change?
Well, that's a good question. We were just talking with the Justice Coalition meeting last night about how the state laws changed as far as the use of force, and there's been a lot of pushback on how they're planning to implement that, and people that are making the policies are more or less still trying to maintain the status quo. And so because this is all, it literally just started at the first of the year, and so we're not sure what it's going to actually look like. They're going to have to change their policies whether they like it or not, because ultimately the next person who gets killed, they're going to be held to the standard of what the law is now, not what it was. And so those are the battles that are ahead more so than anything else. I mean, some cities have made strides to change their policies and to improve, but many have dug their heels in and are making us drag them through court to compel the change. So
There's a whole entity called POST that sits in Sacramento. It's Police Officer Standardization Training or some shit like that, that is responsible for ensuring that police training is up to whatever local and state laws say. We've seen the rise of folks like Jennifer Everhart who are doing trainings on implicit bias and explicit bias. You're the racist or you're not, in my opinion, but we can call it whatever we need to. No disrespect to Ms. Everhart. just you training up the wazoo. The data shows that training actually doesn't work. You can't train something. That's what I said. You cannot fix this thing. You have to transform this thing, right? And then like there's a study that came out of St. Louis. I don't know if it was Washington or not, but showed that actually the more diverse police departments are, the more murders happen. Assimilation into white supremacist culture, and Ice Cube said it best: black cops showing out for the white cop.
The culture, it's the culture of it. If you don't buy in, you get kicked out. There's a reason why departments have 1 to 2 year probationary period when they get rid of you for no reason at all. If you don't buy in, you leave, and and they're observing you the whole time. And the reason why the training programs have you working with multiple different officers is so that everyone can evaluate whether you fit in. Like one of my training components for the Napa Sheriff's Department, which is densely Hispanic population of lower income, a lot of undocumented folks. I was trained that if you see a Latino person with a white hat on, you find a reason to pull him over. That was my training, because that's his good hat. He's partying. He's probably drunk. Let's take his head. This is my field training officer. And so when I was going, whoa, that doesn't sound right, and they're starting to trigger, maybe she doesn't fit in. Maybe she's not one. And if it didn't pick up here, there'd be 4 more training officers before I'm done. And then a couple of years to observe you to make sure that you're ready to, toe the company's line. And if you're not, you don't fit in. And people realize that fairly quickly. And if you speak of the ills that your brother in blue, once you become a police officer, you're not black or brown or white, you're blue. And that's what it is. And if you say, hey, what are you doing? You're the target. And so the culture of violence in policing, like Kat said, goes back to slave patrol. It's historic and so dense, and that culture is something that you either buy in or you get out. And so it doesn't matter what race you are if you choose to do it. You've made a decision to put blue in front of your soul in many ways.
Bilal has his first African American police chief, but so far we ain't seen nothing.
Because he's still blue. He's been a police because he's been in policing for 25,
And
30
honestly,
years.
I think that's the reason why they hired him.
Well, I mean, and there was talk about that because it was going to placate the community. You're going to pacify
that was
people.
going to appease the black community. Oh my God, we can rest now. We have a black police chief, but we ain't seen nothing.
And today I'm on my 3rd formal complaint to ask them to please get these grown men to quit harassing me and threatening me. And because he's blue. Because he's blue, and we can hope and pray that things are different. But unfortunately, that's you're either blue or you're not blue.
So does that mean that it's only kind of shades of blue across the country? Like there's no place where they do it right?
There's no place where they do it right.
Or even brighter?
There are places where there's less of the socioeconomic divide. And so in places that you go to Orinda has no police problems because everybody there is affluent. Everybody there, if you beat the crap out of this guy's dad's a lawyer, and he's gonna, and it's gonna be an issue. So any place where there's socioeconomic problems, there's gonna be, anytime you got poor people, there's somebody to step on. And so, it's only in the places where there's a high density of affluence, where you have good, the good police that you experience.
And even then, you hear horror stories of black folks that have worked their way up through the capitalist ranks who belong in those neighborhoods, being harassed, targeted, guns drawn on them. I mean,
yes, I have a colleague who was walking in her neighborhood and was accosted. She was with her husband. They just took their child to school, dropped her off, and she's like, "How many PhDs do I need so that you will stop harassing me? I'm trying to simply exist in my own neighborhood." And but we're going to talk about white spaces a little bit later in the lecture series. But Beth, your question was kind of right on, and I was thinking, because as researchers we think, well, what are they doing in other places? Where have they fixed it? Well, there aren't any other countries like ours that have police killings on this. I mean, that are developed and as industrialized as we are. Now we are on par with developing world, and not even in incarceration rates. We're still locking up more people than any other country, regardless of income status. But how do we I know there's been international commissions. I know there's been, I've listened to so many different reports on like, this is the way you can stop people from getting killed all the time. Demilitarize, change the way police training. I mean, it just seems like the system it's so ingrained in the training of the police where that's their training. Shoot, and then
Comply or die.
So it's like, how do we change that? And then
you have to think about the laws too, right? Like a lot of the laws are designed to criminalize blackness. So, like, even if they're just enforcing the laws themselves are biased.
and they've always been there. There's a legacy for that.
I mean, in London, and the cops don't carry guns, but they beat the shit out of black people with batons.
Yes.
Right? Like, so, I mean, demilitarized, yes. In Iceland, I know we know nothing about Iceland, but in Iceland, that the cops go to a scene and they want to use a gun, they have to call the station and get a code and then unlock the code and then they can get the gun. That's similar in parts of Ireland too. But the thing that I hope you take from what I said is that we have to be working towards complete and total transformation. Now, for me, that means abolition. When public safety is no longer designed as incarceration and militarized police, but it's defined as living in a world where we all can thrive, a just, equitable, humane world where we all have the resources that we need to thrive. Where public safety is looked at through a restorative lens, right, as opposed to a punitive lens. And the only way we get there is to create alternatives and then pull the data from those alternatives and then replicate them so that we can impact public debate, because the vast majority of people, even our folks, still are bought into the lie that policing and prisons keep us safe. But the data doesn't bear that out, right? So Oakland, every single year, we're one of the top 10 most deadly cities in the entire country, yet we give almost half of our general fund to law enforcement every single year. I'm not an irrational person, I'm a logical person. Somebody do that math for me, right? So we've got to be organizing, we've got to be writing policy, we've got to be speaking out, we've got to be impacting the public debate, we've got to build alternative models and do that in partnership with the most impacted communities. And it's a long road to walk, but it's the only road there is to walk. Everything else is tinkering around the edges, or as I say, something putting Band-Aids on a gunshot wound. We're just gonna keep bleeding out.
I think if they're taking seriously some of these social determinants of health, then there has to be grant funding and resources behind some of these interventions. And I think that, I think that the medical community has a responsibility to make these resources available for people who want to implement these things, because I mean, I imagine it's pretty hard to implement these things and get people paid and fed, outside of the system. So I think there needs to be,
my team.
I know, there needs to be like a redistribution of wealth, really, like resources. If you're essentially saying that, these communities, these under-resourced communities, and that's having an impact on health, and you essentially need to re-resource these communities, So that's definitely something I'm interested in, because there's a lot of grant money out there, and it needs to go to a certain position.
That's right. And I think you're suggesting to look into COBRA. I mean, I just would like to know how they got so powerful, because we talk about the correctional officers union. I think they are a real union, and they have so much power. But like,
we have a guide coming out, and I'm almost positive that the origin of COBRA is in that guide. My team wrote it, but I'm almost positive it's in the guide. So my commitment is that I will go look at the text for the guide, I will copy and paste it, and I will send it to you. But I'm positive, because it's a guide and training, because we want to do for communities across the state to better understand what COBRA is, that hopefully will better direct people's organizing efforts, because if you don't understand your target, then what are you doing? So I'm positive the history is.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I just want to, everyone, please join me in giving a round of applause to our speakers. Thank you so much. We are now, we've got a lot of information, we have a lot of homework to do in terms of how we can organize, how we can impact the debate. how we can gather research and impact policy.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, y'all.
Thank you.